Up next is Jonas Nick from Blockstream, working on Bitcoin research. He's going to talk about mass adoption, but decentralized. Go ahead.
Good morning. How are you? All right. I have the pleasure today to talk about innovations happening in Bitcoin. This will not be a comprehensive overview of Bitcoin scalability, but I will touch on some of the things that I'm working on as part of Blockstream's research group. We will start by going a little bit into the design principles that guide the Bitcoin protocol, and then later get into more advanced topics like cross-input signature aggregation. So, who here thinks that Bitcoin could be a medium of exchange for more than 5 million people? Raise your hands. Okay, that's 90%. What about 15 million? Still, I would say 90%. 100 million? Wow. 1 billion. That's perhaps 80%. 7 billion? Okay, that's more like 50% now. Okay, of course this is just a meaningless trick question, because the real question is, what does using Bitcoin mean? I don't have the answer to this. But I think seeing what's happening here in El Salvador and around the world, it's important that we think deeply about how to approach this problem. Wait, it goes a bit too fast. All right. So it's still mind-blowing to me that you could go to places here and have a decent chance to be able to pay with Bitcoin. However, as many of you experienced, if you actually go to a random place and try to do that, it doesn't work, often for one reason or another. So I made these slides before I came here, and I found a thread on Reddit by someone who claims to be a Salvadoran. And he says, failed transactions are still deducted from your balance. So you have to call Chivo app customer support and make a report of the transaction. You have to wait about a week for your money to be reimbursed. Someone else taking control over your money? Is this Bitcoin? To what degree is this Bitcoin? How do we make more people to use Bitcoin as intended, as peer-to-peer, permissionless money? Here's a quote. It's no quote. There's a quote. Here's a quote by Satoshi. I hope it's obvious it was only the centrally controlled nature of these systems that doomed them. I think this is the first time we're trying a decentralized, non-trust-based system. What this means is that Bitcoin's central promise is digital cash without intermediaries. This is something that makes Bitcoin unique and cannot be copied. The property to resist against powerful... this doesn't work. The property to resist against powerful actors through decentralization is absolutely key. Could we make everyone make their day-to-day Bitcoin transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain? No, because the block size is limited. However, why don't we just increase the maximum block size then? I'm hearing boos in the audience. After all, Bitcoin governance emerges through the software that users run on their computers. So why don't we simply increase the size limit of blocks? Well, we don't, because this increases the cost to run a full node, because now you need to download and verify more stuff, which increases the cost to run a node and decreases the number of full nodes. This touches on a central factor in Bitcoin's resilience. If more decentralized full node exists, then it's harder to take over Bitcoin. Bitcoiners fought a war over the block size increase, which was documented in the book, The Block Size War, which concludes as follows. After an astounding victory, the small block narrative that end users had to agree to protocol rule changes was finally seen as compelling. So what we want to do instead is make most of existing constraints. And one example of this is the Taproot upgrade that just activated Saturday night. So what follows now is an extremely high-level explanation of Taproot. Pre-Taproot, Alice would send Bob a BC1Q address, and Bob would be able to send bitcoins to Alice. Now, post-Taproot, Alice can send Bob a PC1P address, and Bob would be able to send bitcoin to Alice, which are now Taproot-enabled, as you could say. Taproot essentially adds more ways to spend Bitcoin without affecting the old ways. It's a soft fork. One of the features that Taproot provides is the addition of Schnorr signatures. So when Alice wants to send her Bitcoin to Charlie, she authorizes the transaction with a cryptographic signature. Without Taproot, so-called ECDSA signatures are used, but Taproot uses a different kind of signature scheme, Schnorr signatures. Both are standard signature schemes based on the discrete logarithm problem, but Schnorr signatures have a simpler algebraic structure, which means that we can play all kinds of tricks, some of which we will go to in this talk. Schnorr signatures are also simple enough such that the reference implementation in Python can be printed on a shirt. Okay, let's go to our trick. Schnorr signature batch verification. Without batch verification, every signature in the blockchain must be verified individually. With batch verification, full nodes can verify a whole batch of signatures at once. This definitely sounds like black magic, but for example, if there's a batch of size 10,000, so 10,000 signatures, for example, in a block, then verification of this batch is twice as fast than individual verification. This reduces the cost of running a full node, which in turn strengthens Bitcoin's resilience. The current status is that there's a partial proof of concept implementation for Bitcoin Core. But obviously, this does not change the fundamental scaling limits. Instead, the predominant idea for how to scale is to use Bitcoin as a settlement layer and build layers on top with different trust assumptions. On-chain means that the protocol, it's going too fast. Here we are, all right. On-chain means that the protocol affects Bitcoin's rule set, and Bitcoin nodes must be in consensus about this rule set. One example of this is the Taproot upgrade. On top, you see off-chain layer 2 protocols, like for example, multi-party payment channels like Lightning and Coinpool, sidechains like Liquid and federated eCash. They build on on-chain protocols and can be used without a change to Bitcoin's rule set. There's a whole zoo of layer 2 protocols, and they can be combined in various ways, but we're not going to go deeper into this. In between on-chain and off-chain, we have what we could call off-chain primitives, and we've already seen an example of this, batch verification. There's a few more that we will look at in the remainder of this talk. And besides Taproot, there are also other on-chain updates that you could do. and that we will touch on. But first, let's talk about the principles that define the Bitcoin design space. As we've established already, everything revolves around Bitcoin's resilience. This includes the concept of surveillance resistance, which means that we want to prevent adversaries from clustering wallets and on-chain data and associating wallets with actual identities. It also means that a malicious mining pool is not able to censor individual users because it cannot figure out what these individual users are. Bitcoin should also be usable for payments. We want to increase the throughput of on-chain transactions, for example, by making transactions on-chain smaller. And we want to improve layer 2 protocols. And another essential endeavor is to make Bitcoin wallets more secure and secure wallet setups like MuSig more affordable. One approach to achieve this goal is indistinguishability. That means that transactions look the same independent of their use as simple payments versus as being part of a complex protocol. So if one sees a transaction on the network, one cannot distinguish whether it's a normal payment, a sidechain transaction, a multisig transaction, or part of a Lightning channel. This, of course, makes spying on users on the blockchain more difficult, and it also reduces the cost of using layer 2 because they are now as small as ordinary payments, because otherwise, if they weren't as small, they would be distinguishable. Let's see how Taproot fits into this theme of indistinguishability. Assume, for example, there's a coin that can be spent by Alice immediately or by Bob after 1,000 blocks. Taproot allows hiding unexecuted branches. So if Alice spends the coin, it looks like an ordinary payment, and a blockchain observer is not able to see that there was this other branch that Bob would be able to spend it. We'll now move on to another off-chain primitive. I'm seeing confused faces in the audience. I'm not sure why that is. But we'll move ahead anyway. We might have some time for questions. Okay, another off-chain protocol that we're going to touch on is MuSig with key aggregation. Assume, for example, that Alice, Bob, and Charlie have a 2 of 3 multisig wallet. And without key aggregation, all 3 keys and 2 signatures must be written into the chain. But with key aggregation, the signers can compute one aggregate key that they share among themselves and then cooperatively create a single signature. Therefore, multi-signature transactions are indistinguishable from normal transactions. Using a multi-sig wallet is now just as cheap as a normal wallet, and transactions are not recognizable as multi-sig. There are various schemes for making this work. MuSig, for example, only allows n of n multi-signatures and perhaps t of n with some trickery. But the current status is that it's actually replaced by its successor, MuSig 2, which needs less communication. This is important, for example, in Lightning, because otherwise a payment would require an additional half round trip per hop. The implementation and specification is currently in progress. There is an additional scheme that's called Frost, which allows m of n multi-signatures. For example, an 11th of 15 that's currently used in the Liquid sidechain. With Frost, an average federation transaction would cost 75% less than what it costs now in transaction fees. Frost, however, is significantly more complex than MuSig, for example, there's an interactive setup. So key shares of other parties need to be backed up securely. Otherwise, the signers will lose access to their coins. An implementation of a prototype is in progress. Let's look at a little example for MuSig 2 in the two-signer case. MuSig 2 consists of two communication rounds. In the first round, the signers exchange these values R. They are also called nonces. They do some computation on it, and then they send each other partial signatures S. They add the signatures, and then they arrive at a final transaction. The signers need to remember the nonces they sent in the first round until they receive the other signers' nonces. Otherwise, it could happen that they reuse their nonce, which leads to a leak of their secret signing key and therefore the loss of their coins. While this is not a problem in an already stateful protocol like Lightning, it's currently unclear how to do this in hardware wallets, which need to be shut down at some point if you're going to another hardware wallet, for example, and another vault to retrieve the next hardware wallet in a multisig setup. Let's move on to the final off-chain primitive that we're going to discuss here, adapter signatures. Adapter signatures can be used to implement atomic swaps like Lightning payments, DLCs, or peer swap. And without adapter signatures, a full on-chain hash needs to be stored into the blockchain, whereas with adapter signatures, an off-chain adapter signature protocol can be used in order to make this transaction indistinguishable from other transactions. How is this useful? It is useful because you can do tricks in the Lightning network, for example. So Lightning right now uses hash time lock contracts, HTLCs, which are not only visible on chain, but they're also the same on the whole payment route. But alternatively, the Lightning network could use point time locked contracts. What point means in this context is elliptic curve points, but that's details. PTLCs on the payment route are distinct so that two nodes do not know that they are on the same route, which makes it more difficult to spy on Lightning users. Now we're moving back to protocols that would indeed require an update to Bitcoin's protocol rules, namely a soft fork. This soft fork would keep Taproot's properties and add new features. In this particular case, the feature is cross-input signature aggregation. Let's start with half aggregation. There's a typo on the slide. The with should be replaced by without. So without half aggregation, blocks contain at least one signature per spent coin. With half aggregation, blocks contain a half aggregate signature that is half as big as the sum of the individual signatures. For examples, miners could use a function called aggregate that takes the individual signatures and aggregates them into a single signature. This process is non-interactive, which means that the signers don't need to communicate with the miners don't need to communicate with the signers for this to work. For example, 10 half aggregate signatures take the same space as 6 ordinary signatures. Therefore, you can fit more transactions into a block. And half aggregation is provably secure, but the extent to which it could be added to Bitcoin is still an open research question. Let's move on to full aggregation. Without full aggregation, transactions contain at least one signature per spent coin. With full aggregation, transactions contain exactly one aggregate signature. And the size of this signature is equal to the size of an ordinary Schnorr signature, namely 64 bytes. Signing, however, is interactive now, so all signers must work together to produce an aggregate signature, and miners cannot just do that when assembling blocks. The result is smaller transactions and an incentive for CoinJoin. If I, for example, CoinJoin with another person, then there's only one transaction signature. So I would share the transaction fee of the signature with the other party instead of paying for the full transaction signature on my own. Full aggregation is an active research object and does not have a security proof yet. In this graph, we see how much the size of an average transaction would be reduced by aggregation. For half aggregation, we see a 20% improvement. For full aggregation, 25%. When doing both half and full aggregation, there's a over 30% improvement in transaction size. And doing a large CoinJoin with full aggregation instead of an average transaction would reduce transaction size by 40%. Transaction size is important for storage and transmission. Am I running late? 5 minutes. 5 minutes is good. But for fees, what actually matters is transaction weight. Since the signature is already part in the discounted part of the transaction, the witness, the savings are not as significant in terms of transaction weight. Half aggregation reduces the size by 7%, full aggregation by 10%, using both half and full aggregation by about 12%, and if you would do a large CoinJoin, it would reduce the weight by 15%. Would you be more willing to do a CoinJoin if you could save 15% in fees? Probably. So, we're coming to the concluding slides. You can find the slides on nikla.ninja/slides. At this point, it's unclear what kind of trade-offs users are going to make. However, staying resilient takes precedence. And with it, the key properties of surveillance resistance, usability for payments, and wallet security need to be ensured. Indistinguishability helps with achieving these properties. If you want to get involved in these discussions, download the slides, click on the links, but also subscribe to the Bitcoin Ops mailing list, the Bitcoin Dev mailing list, the Lightning Dev mailing list, and there are a lot of other great resources out there. And lastly, there's this really fun page called bitcoinproblems.org that poses open research problems and definitely needs more content. Thank you.
Are there any questions? We've got time for 1 or 2 questions. Go ahead.
Hi, Jonas. I was just curious, my ears pricked up when you mentioned security proofs. So we're talking about cross-input signature aggregation. We're talking about some variant of MuSig, or I don't even know how it would...
There's no security proof for full signature aggregation in the discrete logarithm setting in the security model that we are interested in.
But what are we not using something like MuSig 2 for that, or am I misunderstanding? How would it work? What's the actual...
The difference between MuSig and signature aggregation is mainly the signed message, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
In MuSig,
okay, yeah.
we're all spending the same coin, which means that the signature hash and the message that we're signing is the same for us, whereas in cross-input aggregation, we have different messages, a different one for every input that we spend.
Nick, would you support removing with a CISA soft fork, removing the witness discount to get back to normal buys and not virtual buys and incentivize CoinJoin and make Luke Dashir happy?
I can't say whether I'm in support of it or not at this point, but I think there are things in this area that can be reconsidered.
Hello. Okay, what are the bottlenecks for the different improvements you mentioned to be deployed and widely adopted?
So for the off-chain primitives that I mentioned, they work today in Bitcoin and people are already using it in production, MuSig, for example. But I think it may take a bit of time first to implement this. We need a specification, which we don't have right now. Specification is very important, so we get interoperable software. And then also users need to learn that they really have a benefit from using this because they will have smaller transactions and also blockchain observers will have a harder time trying to cluster wallets. And I think this is a big improvement, but it will take a while, I guess, for users to realize that.
Thank you.
Okay, last question.
Hey Nick, great talk. So you, well, actually you like give the answer to half of my question already. So I was wondering if we have MuSig too, which is not in production yet, quote unquote, and we have Frost, which is not in production yet. If we'd like to do any kind of multi-sig like scheme with Taproot, we cannot do it right now, right? So we should like fall back to using any scheme that we were using before.
As of today, I'm not aware of a production-ready implementation of MuSig that is also stable and will not change. But hopefully in the next coming weeks, the situation will change very quickly. If you don't want to use MuSig, for example, because MuSig has some pitfalls that you need to think about, mainly the statefulness. We only touched on it very briefly, but there may be reasons why you don't want to use this for now. For example, in hardware wallets, then you have to use Taproot script span path with objects again.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you.